My daughter was in surgery for 6 hours, and the only thing keeping me sane was a cup of terrible Tim Hortons coffee and an old man I'd never met before in my life. He was sitting 2 chairs down from me in the surgical waiting room at Vancouver General. Thin, bent forward a little, wearing a plaid flannel shirt that had seen better days. His hands were folded in his lap and he was staring at the floor the way people do when they're not really looking at anything. I didn't want to talk. I just wanted my daughter to be okay. But somewhere around hour 3, he looked over at me and said quietly, "First time waiting like this?" "My daughter," I said. "Car accident." He nodded slowly. "Mine too. My wife. Hip replacement." He paused. "Third time." We didn't say much after that, but there was something comforting about just not being alone in that room. His name was Russell Cook, retired postal worker from Burnaby, 71 years old. He'd been married to the same woman for 46 years and he still got nervous every time she went under anesthesia. Around hour 5, my son-in-law walked in. His name was Craig Whitfield. My daughter had been married to him for 9 years. He was 43, worked in commercial real estate in downtown Vancouver. Always dressed well, always had the right thing to say. The kind of man who makes a good first impression and keeps making it, over and over, until you stop looking closely. He spotted me, crossed the room, shook my hand. "Walter called me," he said. That was my neighbor, Walter Briggs, who'd been with me when I got the call. "How is she?" "Still in surgery," I said. They said the bleeding was controlled. We just have to wait. Craig nodded, pulled out his phone, sat down across from me. Within 2 minutes, he was typing something. I told myself it was work. He ran a busy operation. People needed him. I glanced over at Russell. He was watching Craig with the kind of still, quiet attention you only develop after a certain number of years on this earth. Not judging, just watching. Craig stayed about 40 minutes. Then he said he had a call he couldn't miss, kissed me on the top of the head like I was the one in surgery, and left. Russell watched him go. Then he turned to me and his voice dropped. "That's your son? Son-in-law?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What's your daughter's name?" "Fiona," I said. He nodded, looked back at the door Craig had walked through. Then he said something I didn't understand until 3 weeks later. "Be careful with that one. I want to go back a bit before I tell you what happened next. I need you to understand who I am, because this story doesn't make sense unless you know where I'm coming from. My name is Gordon Ashby. I'm 68 years old. I spent 32 years working as a civil engineer for the city of Vancouver. Bridges, drainage infrastructure, the kind of work that nobody thinks about until something breaks. I retired 4 years ago with a pension, some savings, and a house in East Vancouver that Linda and I bought in 1989 for $210,000. I don't need to tell you what it's worth now. Linda passed away 5 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I still haven't fully adjusted to it. I don't think I will. Fiona is our daughter. She's 38. She was a physiotherapist before the accident, ran her own practice out of a clinic in Kitsilano. She's sharp, warm, the kind of person who fills a room without trying. She got that from Linda. Craig came into the picture about 11 years ago. I never fully took to him, but I told myself that was just being a protective father. He was charming. He made Fiona happy, at least on the surface. He remembered birthdays. He asked about my work. He complimented the house every time he came over. Always said he loved the original hardwood floors, the high ceilings, the neighborhood. I should have paid more attention to what he was complimenting. Fiona came home from surgery that evening. A truck had run a red light on West 4th and caught the driver's side of her car. Fractured ribs, a broken collarbone, a small bleed in her spleen that the surgeons had managed to stop without removing it. She was going to be fine. She was going to need a long recovery, but she was going to be fine. I was there when they moved her to a room. Craig arrived about 20 minutes after she was settled, brought flowers from the shop in the lobby. He held her hand, stroked her hair, said all the right things. I sat across the room and watched him and tried to figure out what Russell Cook had meant. Be careful with that one. I told myself it was nothing. An old man making assumptions. He didn't know Craig. He didn't know our family. But I couldn't shake it. The next morning I went back to the waiting room, hoping Russell might still be around. His wife had been discharged the previous evening, the nurse at the desk told me. Went home to Burnaby. He hadn't left anything. No note, no number. Just those 4 words sitting in my chest like a stone. The first 2 weeks of Fiona's recovery, Craig was attentive, brought her meals, helped her get to follow-up appointments, worked from home most days. I came by every afternoon. We'd sit together, the three of us, watch something on television, eat dinner. It felt almost normal. Then it started. It was subtle at first. Craig mentioned, casually, over dinner, one night, that Fiona's practice was going to struggle with her being off for 3 months. Insurance covered some of it, not all. He was worried about the cash flow. I said I'd help if they needed it. He said he didn't want to put me in that position. But if I was offering just a short-term bridge, $20,000, just until the insurance settled. I wrote the check the next day. Of course I did. That's my daughter. 2 weeks later, Craig pulled me aside after a visit. He looked tired, stressed. He said there had been a complication with a commercial property deal he'd been working on for months, a deal that was going to set them up for years. He just needed to hold on a little longer. Could I help? Just another $15,000. He'd pay it all back by spring. I wrote that check too. Then Fiona mentioned, without any apparent concern, that Craig had asked her about refinancing the house. Their house, in South Granville, the one they'd bought together. He wanted to pull equity to cover some debts she didn't fully understand. She seemed tired when she told me. She said Craig had explained it, but she'd been on painkillers and hadn't quite followed. I didn't sleep that night. I started thinking about things I'd pushed aside. The way Craig always brought up the value of my house. The way he'd once asked, just in passing, whether I'd updated my will since Linda passed. The way he'd offered, about a year ago, to help me organize my finances. Said he had a guy, a financial advisor, very good, could help me consolidate everything, make it simpler. I'd said no. Something had made me say no. I thought about Fiona, about how she'd been before the accident. A little quieter than usual, I realized. A little more careful about what she said around Craig. A little less herself. I started paying closer attention. I asked Fiona's friend Teresa, who'd known her since university, if everything seemed okay. Teresa hesitated before she answered. That hesitation was its own answer. She said Fiona had mentioned some stress at home, money stuff, that Craig had been pressuring her about financial decisions she wasn't comfortable with, that there had been some arguments. I got the name of a lawyer from a colleague who'd retired from the city. Neil Wachter, family and estate law downtown, had been practicing for 30 years. I called him that week. I told him everything. The checks, the refinancing conversation, Craig's history of asking questions about my assets. Neil listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked me one question. Has Craig ever had access to any of your accounts? I said no. Good, keep it that way. And Gordon, I want you to call an investigator I work with. Her name is Karen T.A. She's thorough and she's discreet. I met Karen at a coffee shop on Commercial Drive the following Monday. She was in her late 30s, quiet, precise, the kind of person who makes you feel like she's already 3 steps ahead of the conversation. She took notes in a small notebook, asked about Craig's business, his debts, his habits. Did he gamble? I didn't know. Did he have other investments besides real estate? I didn't know. Did Fiona manage her own finances separately? Mostly, I thought. Karen said she'd start pulling public records. Property liens, corporate filings, court records. She'd look at his business entity. She'd be in touch. She called me 9 days later. Gordon, I need you to come in. There's quite a bit here. I went to her office in Burnaby. She had a folder on the desk. She opened it slowly, like she was being careful with something heavy. Craig's real estate company, Whitfield Pacific Properties, had a judgment against it from the BC Supreme Court. Filed 14 months ago. A former business partner had sued him for $340,000 in misappropriated funds. Craig had settled out of court, quietly. The settlement was sealed, but the filing was public. There was a second lien on their South Granville house. Recent. Filed 8 weeks ago. A private lender. $230,000 at a rate that made my stomach drop. Karen spread out printed emails. She'd obtained them legally, she said, through Fiona's account with her permission. Fiona had agreed to cooperate once I'd told her what I was doing. In the emails, Craig was writing to someone named Bryce, who I didn't recognize, discussing what he called the Ashby situation, saying that with Fiona's accident, the timing was actually good, that I'd be more generous right now than I would under normal circumstances, that once he got me to consolidate my estate planning, he could restructure things more efficiently. There was one more email. Craig to Bryce. Subject line: Option B. In the email, Craig had written that if the direct approach didn't work, they had a fallback. He'd talked to someone who had worked in financial elder law. There was a process, he wrote, for families dealing with a parent who showed signs of cognitive decline. If they could establish that I was struggling, getting confused about finances, losing track of things, it would give Craig, as Fiona's husband, a legal pathway to petition for a supported decision-making arrangement. Or stronger. He was talking about having me declared incompetent. Karen watched me read it. She didn't say anything. She just waited. I set the paper down on her desk and sat there for a moment without speaking. My wife had been gone 5 years. I'd kept her garden alive every summer since she died because I didn't know what else to do with the grief. I'd raised a daughter who was kind and strong and good. I'd worked for 32 years and paid my taxes and fixed the city's drainage problems and never asked anyone for anything. And this man, sitting at my dining room table eating my food, was planning to tell a court I wasn't capable of managing my own life. I called Neil from Karen's parking lot. He picked up on the second ring. I said, "We need to move." Neil and Karen worked together over the next week. We moved quietly and fast. First, I changed my will. Everything to Fiona in trust, with specific conditions. A trusted friend of Neil's, another lawyer named Ida Chung, was named as estate trustee. Craig's name appeared nowhere. Second, I restructured my bank accounts, moved my savings and my investment holdings to a different institution entirely. New passwords. Two-factor authentication on everything. Called the bank directly and put a notation on my file that no changes were to be made without my personal confirmation in person with photo ID. Third, I sent Craig a check for $35,000 and told him it was the last one. He called me that afternoon, warm, grateful, said it meant the world to him. Said he'd have everything sorted out by spring, just like he'd promised. Said I was more than a father-in-law, I was a real partner. I thanked him and hung up. I didn't tell Fiona about the emails yet. Neil had advised me to wait. If Craig knew that Fiona had seen them, he might escalate. We needed a little more time. I spent that week going through every document in my filing cabinet. Bank statements going back 10 years, investment portfolios, the deed to the house, my RRSP and TFSA statements. I made copies of everything and gave the originals to Neil for safekeeping. Then I found something I hadn't looked at in 2 years. A joint account, small, that Linda and I had opened together back in the early 2000s. A small savings account, barely touched, $1,200 in it. And 6 weeks ago, someone had requested a change of address on the account. The new address was in South Granville, Craig's address. I called the bank. They confirmed it. The request had come in writing. The signature on file matched mine. It didn't match mine. I went to the branch in person the next morning, spoke with the branch manager, a calm, careful woman named Patricia Ng. She pulled up the form. We sat together and looked at my signature, and then we looked at the one on the form. She said, "I'm going to need to flag this, Mr. Ashby." I said, "I know." I called the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit that afternoon. A constable named Desjardins took my statement. I gave him the account change form, the emails Karen had obtained, the records of the transfers Craig had requested. Desjardins was methodical, thorough. He said they'd open a file. He said I should continue to act normally with Craig. "Don't let him know what you've found," he said. "And if he asks me for more money?" Desjardins paused. "Tell him you're thinking about it." That evening, Craig called. He wanted to meet for coffee, just the two of us, he said. Check in. He'd been thinking about things and wanted to talk. We met at a cafe near Broadway. He was relaxed, friendly. He talked about Fiona's recovery, about how well she was doing, about how grateful he was for everything I'd done for the family. Then he mentioned the house, my house, East Vancouver. He brought it up sideways, talking about the real estate market, about how values had peaked and might be leveling off, about how it might actually make sense to look at liquidating some assets before things shifted. He said he could help me with that. He had contacts. He'd managed similar transactions before. I looked at him across that cafe table. This man I'd sat next to at Christmas dinners for 9 years. This man who had held Fiona's hand in the hospital and said all the right things. I said, "Let me think about it." He smiled, told me to take my time, said he just wanted to make sure I was protected. 3 days after that coffee, Fiona came to the house. Just her, without Craig. She was healing well enough to drive again. She sat down at the kitchen table. The same table where we'd eaten 1,000 dinners, and I made tea, and I told her everything. I showed her the emails. I showed her the forged signature. I showed her what Karen and Neil had found. She read everything without speaking. When she finished, she was very still for a moment. Then she said quietly, "I knew something was wrong. I kept telling myself I was wrong." I reached across the table and took her hand. She said, "How long?" I said I didn't know. "At least 2 years based on what Karen had found. Probably longer." She looked at the table for a long moment, then she straightened. "What do we need to do?" We met with Neil and Constable Desjardins 2 days later. Fiona was there. She was calm, clear-headed. She'd already spoken to a family lawyer of her own, a woman named Vivian Park, whom Teresa had recommended. Desjardins had more by then. Craig's business partner, the one who'd sued him, had agreed to speak with investigators. What he described was a pattern: access, trust, slow extraction. He said Craig had done this before, not to a family member, but to an elderly client of a former colleague. The complaint had been filed in Alberta. It had never gone to trial. Fiona filed for separation that Thursday. Craig came to the house that evening, not mine, their house. He found the locks changed and a legal notice from Vivian Park's office taped to the door. Fiona was not there. She was at my house, in her old room, with the same curtains Linda had picked out when Fiona was 16. Craig called me that night. His voice was different, harder. He said I'd made a mistake. He said I didn't understand what I'd done to my family. He said Fiona would come around. I said, "Good night, Craig," and hung up. Constable Desjardins called the following Monday. They had enough to proceed. The forged signature was confirmed by a document examiner. The pattern of transfers, the email communications, the statement from the Alberta complaint, it built a case that the Crown felt was supportable. Craig was charged 3 weeks later, fraud over $5,000, forgery, and, based on the Option B emails and the evidence of coordinated intent, criminal harassments under Section 264 of the Criminal Code, he was released on conditions. One of those conditions was no contact with Fiona or with me. The trial took 4 months. I testified. I sat on that stand and answered every question they asked me, about the checks, about the conversations, about what Craig had said to me at that cafe. The Crown played the emails. They called Karen Say. They called the document examiner. They called Fiona. Watching Fiona testify was the hardest part. She sat in that witness box with her shoulders straight and her voice steady, and she told them what her marriage had been. She told them about the arguments, about money, about the pressure, about the times she'd questioned something Craig had said, and he'd explained it away until she stopped questioning. She told them about the slow, patient way a person can be made to feel like their own instincts are wrong. The jury took 2 days, guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Craig to 3 years in federal custody, plus restitution of the $35,000 he'd taken from me, plus a 10-year prohibition on acting in any financial advisory or fiduciary capacity. After the sentencing, outside the courthouse, Fiona held on to me for a long time without saying anything. Vivian Park stood nearby, giving us space. The afternoon was gray and cold, the way Vancouver gets in February, and I could smell rain coming in off the water. Eventually Fiona said, "I should have seen it." I said, "I should have too. Years ago." She shook her head. "You couldn't have known." I thought about Russell Cook, sitting 2 chairs down from me in that waiting room, watching Craig walk out with his phone in his hand. An old man in a plaid flannel shirt who'd seen enough of life to recognize something the rest of us were still making excuses for. Be careful with that one. I found Russell 3 weeks after the sentencing. I called the Burnaby Postal Depot, explained who I was, asked if anyone knew a retired carrier named Russell Cook. The woman who answered said she'd pass a message to someone who might know him. 2 days later, my phone rang. "Russell," I asked if we could meet. We sat in a diner in Burnaby on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 old men with coffee and pie, and I told him everything that had happened. He listened the way he had in that waiting room, still, attentive, not interrupting. When I finished, he said, "How's your daughter?" I said she was doing well, healing. She'd reopened her practice. She was seeing a counselor. She was, I said, slowly becoming herself again. Russell nodded and stirred his coffee. "Good," he said. "That's all that matters." I asked him how he'd known. In that waiting room, those few hours, how had he read Craig so quickly? He was quiet for a moment. "I worked a mail route in Burnaby for 28 years, he said. "You see a lot of houses. You see who's home and who isn't. You notice things. He paused. A man whose wife is in surgery doesn't spend 40 minutes looking at his phone and leave early. That's not love. That's obligation. And obligation has a smell. We sat there a while after that, paid the bill, stood in the parking lot in the November cold. Before I got in my car, Russell said, "Will you see him again? Your son-in-law?" "No," I said. "I don't think so." He nodded. "Good answer." 6 months after the trial, I started volunteering with a legal aid clinic in East Vancouver that helps seniors navigate financial abuse cases. A coordinator there, a woman named Bernadette Houle, had been working in elder law for 20 years. She'd heard every version of this story. She was the one who told me there's a name for what Craig had done to me. Financial grooming, the slow, patient construction of access and trust until the target doesn't know where their own decisions end and the manipulation begins. Bernadette said the hardest cases were always family, because love is the mechanism. Love is what makes you write the check without asking enough questions. Love is what makes you explain away the things that don't feel right. I sit with people now, once a week, in a small room at the clinic. People who are ashamed, mostly. People who think they should have seen it. People who blame themselves for being trusting. I tell them what I've learned. I tell them that being trusting isn't the problem. The problem is being alone with it. The moment you bring another set of eyes to something that doesn't feel right, the whole shape of it changes. I tell them about Russell Cook, about a stranger in a waiting room with a cup of bad coffee, and a lifetime of watching people who thought no one was looking. I tell them about Fiona, who is doing well, who calls me every Sunday, who is learning slowly to trust her own instincts again. And I tell them about myself, a 68-year-old engineer who spent his career making sure that bridges held, that infrastructure worked, that things would not fail when people needed them, and who nearly missed the collapse happening inside his own family because he didn't want to believe what he was looking at. The house in East Vancouver is still mine. The hardwood floors are still there. The high ceilings, the neighbor's maple tree that drops leaves into my gutters every fall, Linda's garden in the back that I still tend every spring. I'm still here. And somewhere in Burnaby, Russell Cook is probably watching the mail being sorted by someone else now, sitting in his kitchen with his wife of 46 years, not thinking about me at all. I think about him a lot. There's a thing people say about warning signs, that we ignore them because we don't want to see them. That's true, as far as it goes. But I think there's something more. I think we ignore them because we don't want to be the kind of person who suspects the people they love. We don't want to be suspicious. We don't want to be paranoid. We've been taught that love means trust, and so when something chips at the trust, we patch it over quickly before we have to ask what it means. But love without honest attention isn't love. It's just loyalty with your eyes closed. Russell opened my eyes. Not with evidence, not with a file full of emails and forged signatures. Just with 2 words delivered quietly in a hospital waiting room by a man who'd seen enough of the world to know when something didn't add up. Be careful with that one. I was, and because I was, I'm still here. My daughter is still here. Her practice is open. Her name is on the door of that clinic in Kitsilano, same as it's always been. That's enough. That's more than enough. And if you're sitting somewhere right now, wondering if the thing you're feeling about someone close to you is paranoia or something real, I want you to know that it's okay to look. It's okay to ask questions. It's okay to get a second set of eyes. You don't have to blow up your life to protect it. You just have to stop letting love be the reason you stop paying attention.